A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I never imagined my day would spiral into a nightmare just because I forgot to lock my bathroom door. The chain of events started innocently enough when I left my apartment for the first time in weeks, both anxious and excited to find the right real estate agent to help me sell my place. I'd gone through a rough patch recently, loss of my job, and subsequently, a deep financial hole I needed to crawl out of, and the idea of leaving my little sanctuary after years of solitude sent a tingle of dread down my spine, so I promised myself I'd be careful. After a morning researching agents online, I scheduled an appointment with Sarah, a promising young real estate agent known for her thrilling social media posts and an impressive list of recent sales. I met her in the lobby of my building, her blonde hair perfectly slicked back, a professional demeanor cloaking what I guessed was a truly vibrant personality. She reassured me that everything was going to be okay as she ushered me into my apartment, but I felt an undercurrent of anxiety when it hit me. I hadn't tidied up after my frantic week of hibernation. As we stepped inside, the familiar scent of stale air greeted me while remnants of my last meal lay unwashed, scattered in the sink. I motioned for her to start, but I couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. The pent-up dread weighed heavily, making my skin crawl with self-awareness. Sarah seemed unfazed, though, and began discussing the potential of my living space. Her client, a young couple who had just begun peering down the hallway from 2 floors up, wrapped in with anticipation outside the door, and I could sense that future buyers were gathering intrigued in their minds. I turned to pour myself a glass of water but was interrupted by a sudden commotion. My bathroom door swung wide open, and before I realized it, I was standing completely naked behind a half-open door that separated my shared space from my hidden refuge. The couple, whom I'd only seen on videos scrolling through social media, gasped in disbelief, but only momentarily. Their shock turned to bewilderment before they averted their eyes, laughter echoing off faux wood floors as I bolted to cover my nakedness, grabbing a nearby throw blanket in a panic. Sarah's face twisted between shock and humor as she quickly ushered them out after the initial surprise wore off, and all I could hear as I stood there trembling was the sound of my own heartbeat thrumming loudly against my eardrums as I debated whether I should just disappear into the ground right then and there. Everything about that moment felt surreal, as I felt like I had turned into some absurd character in a sitcom wrongfully scripted to reflect my real-life embarrassment. I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, pacing my apartment like a trapped animal, consumed by shame. But it didn't stop there. As Sarah returned, the glint in her eyes suggested something uncomfortably thrilling had occurred, a spark of excitement from unfolding drama. I avoided her gaze, but she seemed to sense my vulnerability, telling me that it happened more often than I might think, in a world that pushed the boundaries of personal space, where privacy had become an elusive concept. But there was something more unsettling in her tone, a hint of amusement that made my skin prickle again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that being forgotten was the least of my concerns because in the haze of my humiliation, something sinister lurked in the back of my mind. Days turned into weeks, and somehow, I figured that everyone had probably forgotten about the disastrous walk-in, but then late one night, I heard something odd, faint thumping against my apartment door that reverberated through the walls, an uncomfortable reminder of all that had transpired. I opened the door cautiously, only to find a crumpled note wedged into the doorway, penned in an aggressive yet familiar scrawl, "We aren't done yet." It rattled me to my core, the chill crawling down my spine intensifying as I reflected back on the enigma that enveloped Sarah and the couple. I hadn't thought twice about the whispers I heard trailing behind them during our next exchanges, but clearly, I hadn't considered someone might be keeping tabs on my every move. Was I being targeted for failure, or was it just a sick joke strung along from that embarrassing moment? The anxiety curled in my gut until all the warmth I'd yearned for grew cold in a heartbeat, and it spiraled into a toxic mess of paranoia. As I lay in bed that night, shadows danced against the wall, and every creak of the building's settled sound weighed down heavy on my soul. I thought of Sarah, how long she'd been waiting in that hallway, smirking and waiting for me to unravel before her surprise guests. Under cover of night, I fell asleep with the covers pulled tight, battling my heavy eyelids. Dreams morphed into images of unfamiliar faces and playful laughter, what started as mockery but grew into something darker. One evening, after days of hearing unexplainable sounds and footsteps I swore echoed into my walls, I shoved my sleep-deprived body out of bed, desperately clutching my phone's flashlight. I tried dismissing the chill lingering in my gut, crafting rational explanations as I crept toward each room. But then everything froze. The silhouette of a figure cloaked in the darkness was waiting for me, the shadows lying just behind where the faint moonlight spilled across the living room floor. It didn't look like Sarah, nor did it resemble anyone I had ever met, But there stood someone unfurling that day's events once more like an outlined tragedy of life. The weight of my shame returned tenfold, but the horror of being watched, truly watched, consumed me, drowning me in a surreal fear that felt more human than I'd known. They whispered my name, yet their voice was all wrong, twisted like they'd been remolded by rejection, feasting off my vulnerability in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. I stood rooted in place as their breath curled through the air, carrying with it the fragrance of danger, and in that lingering moment, I realized the seamless facade of my life had cracked wide open, leaving me exposed to a strange combination of hostility and amusement, and suddenly I was buoyed by the horrifying truth: some stories don't end when we want them to, but rather stretch like an unwelcome guest haunting shadows, willing to reappear right when the light fades away. I had just turned 15 when I first met Clara, our new au pair, who arrived from Europe with an accent so thick I could taste it, and she brought an air of mystery that captivated me instantly. She was supposed to help with my younger siblings, but somehow, our connection was electric, charged with tension that lingered in the air like static before a storm. At first, we exchanged shy glances, her laughing at my awkward jokes, and I noticed how she'd subtly touch my arm while explaining something mundane about her life. It was innocent enough, I told myself, a friendship between a boy and a woman twice my age, but as the weeks passed, our bond deepened amidst the backdrop of my parents' obliviousness. We began stealing moments together, whispers in the kitchen late at night when everyone else was asleep, the way she'd read to me from her favorite novels, our knees brushing against each other while we shared secrets, and something about her presence made my teenage heart race in ways I didn't fully understand. One night, while the house was silent and the moon bathed everything in a ghostly glow, I found her sitting outside, staring into space, her expression heavy with thoughts that didn't seem to belong in our cheerful household. I dared to join her, and as we shared the darkness of the night, I felt a pull towards her that was almost irresistible, drawn in by the way her eyes sparkled like the stars above us. It was a boundary I knew I shouldn't cross, but when she looked at me, really looked, I felt an uninhibited rush, a longing that whispered in the back of my mind that I was no longer just a kid. That night turned into a turning point, and before I realized what was happening, we were exchanging secret touches and stolen kisses that ignited something I still can't catalog, a heady mix of exhilaration and fear that came with the territory of our forbidden affection. Yet behind the thrill lurked an insidious dread. I was aware that if anyone found out, especially my parents, it would spell doom not only for Clara but also for me. But then a day came when an argument between my parents erupted, and, caught up in the chaos, I slipped out to find Clara. Underneath the willow tree in the backyard, I confessed my feelings for her, words tumbling out in a rushed confession that hung in the air, and rather than recoil, she leaned in closer, her breath mingling with mine as we kissed deeply, the world around us fading as we lost ourselves in that moment. For months, we became engrossed in our clandestine affair, the thrill of secrecy amplifying our every moment together, leaving little breadcrumbs of deception that I buried away under acts of normalcy in front of my family. But then, Clara began to change. She became distant as if she was wrestling with her own demons, and when I cornered her one evening, she told me about a troubling call from her family back home that left her shaken, unveiling a tide of worries about her future and fears about being deported, a reality that cut through the bliss of our affair like a knife. I tried to console her, to promise that we would figure it out together, yet even I could sense the impossible nature of our bond. How could we continue this when the ground beneath us felt increasingly unsteady? Despite the uncertainty, the desire still pulsed like a living organism between us, feeding off our vulnerability, and it culminated in a night where reality crashed down around us. I watched Clara cry, a beautiful mess of sorrow and fear, and without thinking, I whispered I loved her, hoping it would somehow anchor her against the chaos that threatened to engulf her. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she kissed me fiercely and suggested we run away together. A thought that both thrilled and terrified me, but then came the night everything unraveled. It was after a particularly long night binge-watching our favorite series, and I fell asleep on the couch, only to wake up just before dawn to sounds that chilled my blood. I stumbled through the darkened house to find my mother in the kitchen, a phone pressed to her ear, her face pale and haunted. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "Where's Clara?" The room went silent, and suddenly, it wasn't my mother's gaze that fell upon me, but the icy stares of authority beyond her, two men who were waiting just outside our front door like shadows poised to engulf me. Panic gripped my heart, a suffocating wave of anxiety as my mother turned to show me Clara's suitcase packed hastily by the door, the officers informing us that Clara was being taken into custody for overstaying her visa and that my family's whole world would shatter once the dust settled. I watched as she was led away in handcuffs, a heartbreaking mix of horror and rage bubbling within me as I realized I was powerless to stop any of it. The last thing Clara said to me was a promise that she would find her way back to me, but I never spoke to her again. Days morphed into weeks as I tried to navigate through this new reality at home, my parents oblivious yet again, though I wore a mask of normalcy like stone, each moment titling ever more precariously under the burden of betrayal I felt seeping into my veins. I revisited every single moment we spent together, the laughter, whispered secrets, and that wild, reckless love that I felt, a constant reminder of what had been taken from me, and nights spent tossing and turning would bring me no solace. Then came a series of strange events that took a turn I never could have anticipated. A soft tapping on my window one sleepless night revealed the figure of Clara, her silhouette barely visible but unmistakable, eyes wide with a desperate fire that ignited hope buried deep within me. But something was off. She wasn't just running from the past but ran into the unknown, her demeanor twisted by the fear of being trapped. She told me they planned to deport her back home, but my heart sank as I listened. Something felt all too wrong in the energy that enveloped her. Desperate for answers, I leaned closer only to realize she was not alone, shadows looming behind her like the fading embers of a dying fire. I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel their malicious intentions burning through the night air. Clara's eyes flickered with something that looked alarmingly like despair, and suddenly she was not the carefree woman I once knew but a marionette dancing on strings pulled by someone else. She grasped my wrist, and for the briefest moment I felt that electric charge again. But it quickly dissipated, replaced by something dark, something that whispered almost inaudibly, "Run." But it was too late. There was nothing we could do as darkness engulfed us. She vanished into it, a haunting specter leaving nothing behind but a cold chill that dug deep into my soul, marking me with the weight of an unfinished story. Months passed since that night, a gaping hole in me where Clara once resided, her memory splintered and absorbed by time, and now every small sound would send shivers down my spine. Was it her ghost, or just a reminder of what I had lost? Each creak of the house began to feel like a warning, a reminder that not everything was as it seemed, and the shadows outside my window became an ever-watchful presence that I could never fully shake. I thought about Claire often, in stolen moments from school, a tortured love that continued to haunt my existence, and when I looked outside, at night just before I drifted off, I half expected to see her reflection shimmering against the glass, but all I found was the gnawing fear that I could never escape the consequences of our choices. Then one evening, as I was sneaking out for fresh air, I stumbled upon a letter hidden under the floorboard in my room, addressed to me in Clara's messy script, filled with frantic scribbles about not letting go, about truths buried deep under shadows, and a warning: they are still watching. Trust no one, leaving me gasping for breath as everything came crashing down around me. What did she mean by that? Were they waiting for me too? I realized that moving forward meant unearthing secrets long buried, unraveling the twisted threads of our past, and confronting the painful reality that, at 15, love hadn't spared me from a waking nightmare where I must now decide: do I seek the truth and confront the unseen dangers lurking in the shadows, or do I stay lost in my memories, trapped by the lingering secrets we once shared? The choice isn't mine alone anymore, shadowed by the specter of a love I barely understand, and as I look out once more, I can't shake the feeling that the story isn't truly over. It's waiting, lurking just beyond my reach, and whispering ceaselessly in the dark that Clara, and whatever she represents, is still very much a part of my life. When I was in second grade, I had no idea just how much trouble my curiosity could cause, but the moment I walked into that dimly lit classroom, something ominous took root in my young mind, a seed planted by the whispers of my classmates. They spoke of Ms. Riley, the grumpy old teacher with too many rules and a penchant for punishing anyone who dared to misbehave. But my favorite part about her was that she always had a jar of cookies on her desk, tempting us like forbidden fruit. One day, during recess, I overheard two kids talking about a secret passageway they supposedly found behind the school's decrepit library. My imagination ignited. I could practically hear the whispers of adventure calling me, but when I asked around, no one could confirm if it was real. Fueled by curiosity, I decided that I had to find it myself. So, after school ended, I snuck into the library, heart pounding with both fear and excitement, and there it was, a slightly ajar door behind a bookshelf covered in dust, everyday object turned into a portal to the unknown. I pushed it open, nearly knocking over a stack of ancient encyclopedias, and wandered into a narrow, shadowy corridor lined with flickering bulbs that seemed to hum with their own life. I couldn't resist the thrill washing over me as I tiptoed further in, past walls scrawled with strange symbols and remnants of what looked like long-abandoned classes. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, something I couldn't quite place, but as I ventured deeper, a creeping sense of dread began to settle in my stomach, and I turned back just as the air turned icy and wild laughter echoed behind me from the darkness. In my haste to escape, I bumped into an old pipe that groaned like it was alive, and then it came crashing down, sulphurous fumes filling the air as I stumbled back, panicking. I fled the library, my heart racing, convinced that my adventure had been a grave mistake. The very next day, I returned to school, only to find the playground surrounded by caution tape, the laughter of my friends replaced with nervous whispers. Ms. Riley, who was usually a stickler for rules, had turned ghostly pale, and the principal looked like he was about to lose his marbles. It turned out that my little expedition had triggered a chain reaction of events that left the entire school in a state of chaos. There were reports of gas leaks, and the fire department was called, dragging their equipment through the doors like a scene out of a horror movie. And there I was, at the epicenter of it all, feeling like an innocent child caught in a storm I had unintentionally conjured. My friends stared at me with a mix of admiration and horror. I became the architect of their fear as they spun tales about the mysterious corridor that had unleashed chaos upon our esteemed educational establishment. But things took a darker turn when I learned the school was fined $600 for operational violation due to my reckless wandering, and worst of all, I heard whispers that Ms. Riley was going to make an example out of me, her favorite scapegoat to unleash her fury upon. The fear clung to my bones like a shadow, making me anxious whenever I stepped into the school. My days are spent bracing for the repercussions of my actions. I avoided the library, feeling the watchful eyes of the old books on my back, and I shunned recess, fearing the laughter was tinged with the knowledge of my culpability. But I couldn't escape Ms. Riley's gaze, so all I could do was wait for my reckoning. And then, one fateful Thursday afternoon, it happened. Ms. Riley stood before the entire class, eyes scanning the room like a predator, and before I could even take a breath, she called me out. "You think you can just cause chaos and walk away, don't you, Jacob?" she said, voice clawing at my insides like rusted nails. The laughter erupted around me, each giggle a dagger. It stung worse than I could have imagined, as I felt the weight of the fine hanging over my shoulders like a millstone. Ms. Riley pulled a paper from her desk with a flourish, waving it like a trophy of shame, my name scribbled across the top, the fine looming behind it like a storm cloud. "You, Jacob, will write an apology letter to the school, to me, and to the fire department explaining why you cannot play Third Floor Explorer anymore." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I suffered in silence as the classroom erupted in murmurs. That night, I lay wide awake, staring into the darkened corners of my room, grappling with the reality of my actions. I envisioned that creeping corridor, now pulsating in my mind with an otherworldly presence, as if it was mocking me for my cowardice. I became haunted by the shadows that flickered just beyond my line of sight, echoes of laughter laughing at my missteps, and the stench of that ancient library filled my dreams with reminders of death. Weeks passed, and I continued to live in fear of Ms. Riley's wrath, but then something strange began to happen. The more I dwelled on those terrifying moments in the library, the more I felt as if I developed an odd, twisted connection to the corridor, a tether binding me to something unseen. As if it was sending me a message, a gut feeling that encouraged exploration despite the consequences. One day, I gathered enough courage to confront my fears. I crept back to the library, fueled by a strange pull, and this time, I slipped through the doorway once more. Despite the pit of dread swelling within me, the air felt different, charged with electricity as if the corridor was alive. I stumbled deeper, drawn in by an unseen force, discovering decrepit classrooms filled with dust-covered desks and chalkboards, but there was something more, an aura of otherworldly mystery. Suddenly, in the shadows, I saw it, a twisted version of myself staring back from a cracked mirror, eyes wide open as if they held centuries of secrets. It whispered my name, beckoning me forward. Retreat was impossible now. Just as I reached out to touch the glass, a loud bang shattered the silence, and I whipped around to find walls shifting, the faint outlines of warning signs flickering into existence, urging me to escape. I stumbled backward, realizing that whatever hidden knowledge I sought came at a price, and I rushed back towards the exit, breathless and panicked, the laughter of ghosts echoing behind me. When I burst out into the light of the library, the distance between the shadows and me felt intangible. I ran home, heart racing, where I collapsed onto my bed, my body trembling with the weight of what I'd experienced. I told myself to forget what I saw, the corridor was just a trick of my imagination, a figment of a child's fears. But even now, as I type this, that voice, that mirror, lingers in the corner of my mind, and the thought of those secrets both horrifies and fascinates me. I eventually learned to live with the memory of that day, but sometimes, in the stillness of night, I hear the laughter ring in my ears, echoing off the walls of my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that I might still be connected to that corridor, that something trapped within it still watches and waits, waiting for the next curious child to open a door to chaos, waiting for a repeat of history, and the price of ignorance to be paid once more. I am under the influence of cannabis probably 15 out of 24 hours a day. Every day. Initially, it was just a way to cope with the noise, the chaos of an urban life that seemed to drown out any semblance of peace. I started with small puffs shared among friends, laughter spilling into the sultry summer evenings like the smoke that curled above us, but I soon slipped down a rabbit hole of dependence, craving the blissful haze that separated me from the world and my relentless thoughts. Somehow, each day began to blend into the next, an endless loop of green euphoria that dulled any emotional edge, and soon enough, it morphed from joy to a daily ritual. I lost count of how many times I lit up before breakfast, the smell of burnt herb mingling with eggs and coffee, and that warm, fuzzy embrace wrapped around me like a blanket, lulling me into a sweet stupor that I convinced myself was normal. My reflection began to change, the vibrant hues of life fading to a dull pastel that echoed the smoke spiraling above my head. Friends fell away, too, one by one, their laughter replaced by concerned glances as I sank deeper into this comforting cocoon, dismissing their worries with a casual wave, clutching my pipe like a talisman. I began to drift into thoughts that felt disjointed and strange, arguments with the voices in my head that grew louder in the stillness, their insistence piercing through the thick cloud that enveloped me. They whispered darkly, filled with scorn, reminding me of every missed opportunity and every shred of ambition I had allowed to wilt in favor of this sluggish existence, and in that distorted haze, I felt myself fraying. At night, when the world outside grew still beneath the blanket of midnight, the whispers morphed into something else entirely. They transformed into figures, cloaked in shadows that loomed just at the edge of my peripheral vision, feeling more tangible with each drag I took. My apartment became a labyrinth of unfamiliar faces and fleeting fears mingled with sweet cannabis dreams, and I could no longer discern if they were real or merely figments of my mind, a manifestation of my guilt and isolation. Simple tasks like showering and eating became monumental challenges, overtaken by the thrum of dread that pulsed beneath the surface, awakening once I extinguished my joint. I began to avoid mirrors, fearful of acknowledging the hollow-eyed stranger who inhabited my body. Friends stopped visiting, replaced by a parade of drifters I'd invite over in search of human connection, but soon realized they shared the same haze, their laughter echoing hollowly in the darkness of my mind. One rainy Thursday, the sky wept in tune with my thoughts, a perfect reflection of my internal turmoil, and I sank deeper into my sofa, convinced I had become invisible beneath the swirling clouds of my own making. It wasn't until the tapping began, a light knock one night, that startled me from the warm embrace of my weed fog, echoing through the silence of my apartment. At first, I dismissed it, chalking it up to my wild imagination, swirling shadows in the corners, but the knocking persisted, steady and unrelenting, as if someone stood outside my door quietly pleading for entry. Heart racing, I cowered into my sofa, focused on the relentless sound, sweat pooling at my brow while my mind prepared to fall deeper into the rabbit hole. Each knock grew louder, urging me to confront whatever was out there, but dread knew me well by this point, wrapping around my throat, choking the courage from my chest. Anxiety bloomed within me. It could be the police, or worse, a former friend come to confront me about my spiraling addiction, but when I finally mustered the strength to peek through the peephole, I recoiled. The figure outside was gaunt and twisted, with an impossibly elongated face that bore a crooked grin, yet it looked unsettlingly familiar. It was an uncanny echo of myself, but hollowed, eyes sunken deep into its skull, staring at me with an unsettling hunger. I stumbled back, grabbing my stash in a panic at the sight of that ethereal monstrosity and the horrific realization that perhaps I had become a charred reflection of my true self, everything that I had loved stripped away. I sprinted to the window, desperate to escape reality as I methodically rolled the spliff to soothe the panic rising in my chest, but as I inhaled deeply and the smoke rose, so did a flood of faces, those long-gone friends circling my consciousness with pity and disgust, their laughter echoing hauntingly as they faded into my mind's eye. Just as I thought I might choke on the smoke, I caught a glimpse of a flicker outside the window, and there it was again, that familiar face looming outside, pulling on my heartstrings, gasping for life as the shadows thrummed and twisted. In a daze of panic, I grasped my phone, fumbling to call for help, desperate to shatter this web of psyche and reclaim what was left of me, but the screen wouldn't illuminate. The faces outside were swarming now, reaching out with elongated fingers, and all at once, the porch light flickered and went out. I could hear whispers resounding all around me, beckoning, pleading with a voice that sounded so much like my own, begging me to join them in their suffocating embrace. I crushed my spliff against the edge of the table, smoke curling around me, and as I contemplated whether I'd lost my mind entirely or if there was still a flicker of the person I used to be trapped inside the haze, the knuckles rapped once more against my door with a finality I could no longer take. The door trembled under the weight of my fears, pressing against the fragile wall between me and that grotesque reflection of myself, and as I felt the darkness closing in, a sickening certainty washed over me. I was neither alive nor dead, I was forever suspended in between, hidden under the influence of my own devices. It was a night I'll never forget with a man I'll probably never see again, a night shrouded in the kind of darkness that swallowed the flickers of my small-town streetlights, as if the universe itself conspired to keep the sky a suffocating black. I had just moved back home after college, tired, anxious, and still reeling from the pressure of deadlines that never seemed to end, and I decided to walk to the only convenience store that stayed open late, just to grab a pack of smokes. The air was pregnant with the scent of rain as it threatened to fall, and the muffled echoes of distant thunder turned from somewhere deep in the oppressive clouds. It was after 11 when I reached the store, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow that felt so out of place against the wildness of the surrounding night. I could tell the cashier was just as bored as I felt, scrolling through his phone with a vacant expression. I snagged my smokes and, as I stepped out into the cool night air, I noticed a figure leaning against the brick wall beside the store, a man whose presence sent an odd shiver along my spine. He wore a long black coat that seemed to absorb the light, and his face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. For a fleeting moment, I considered turning back and heading home, but something about his demeanor intrigued me. He seemed to radiate an almost magnetic pull, like a moth to a flame, and so, against my better judgment, I approached him. "You look lost," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like dried leaves skimming over asphalt. I laughed uneasily, not quite sure how to respond, and when I glanced up to meet his gaze, the intensity of his eyes unsettled me. They were a vibrant, unnatural shade of blue, almost too bright for the darkness that cloaked him, and I felt an involuntary chill as he fixed me with that penetrating stare. I was startled when he, without any prompt, began telling me a story, about a cursed forest that swallowed anyone who dared enter beyond dusk, how its trees whispered secrets to those unlucky enough to wander too close. The rain began to fall then, a soft patter that turned into a downpour, and we huddled beneath the store's awning as he painted chilling images with words that drew me in deeper, each tale punctuated with an eerie detail that dragged me further from reality. He spoke of a man who had lost his way, who had ventured into that dark place and emerged changed. "You see, some places don't just hold shadows, they hold memories," he said, his gaze unwavering. The allure of his storytelling made the world around us fade, and I found myself hanging on his every word, even as pure dread started creeping into my bones. As he spoke of lost souls and anguish, the atmosphere thickened, and I could swear I saw something moving in the shadows of the alleyway behind him, an elongation, a flicker of movement that felt almost sentient. "You should be careful where you tread, especially when the night calls out to you," the man said, a smile playing upon his lips, and it sent another ripple of unease coursing through me. I wanted to turn back home, to leave whatever strange magic had woven itself around this moment, but I found myself indulging his eerie tales, entangled in the fear he was weaving. Hours slipped by like the minutiae of time had melted. Gripped by fascination, I learned about his own dark encounters. He spoke like a prophet, like someone who had danced too closely to the fire and bore the scars of his own mistakes. The weight of his stories clung to me, his every word a thread tying me to the unfolding panic, and before I knew it, I was sharing my own fears, my own vulnerabilities, what brought me back to this town, the crushing loneliness that pressed upon my chest. He listened, nodding in an understanding nothing could prepare me for. Then, just as quickly as the atmosphere thickened, the rain suddenly subsided, and an uncomfortable silence enveloped us, pregnant with expectancy. I looked at him then, expecting to see that unsettling smile, but instead his eyes shifted to something behind me, a flicker of concern sparking across his features. "You should go," he said, his tone startlingly serious. "You're not safe here." I glanced around, a visceral need to flee taking root as my heart raced. In that moment, I felt it, something lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight's glow, something watching from the depths of the shadows, and with its presence came an unbearable dread that sent me scrambling away. I whipped around toward my distant home, the streets now a labyrinthine stretch of anxiety as I raced to escape this night that had started so innocently. My breath came in gasps, and I could still feel that man's gaze boring into me, urging me onward, but as I reached the edge of my neighborhood, I paused, my heart collapsing in confusion. I turned back, searching for him, but the corner where he had stood was now empty, swallowed by the thick black that gripped the night sky. That lingering sense of dread remained, stretching beyond the confines of the evening until it settled into my bones, but try as I might, I could never shake that feeling that whatever dark force had prowled at the periphery of my existence was waiting for the moment to embrace me fully. I finally made it home, slamming the door behind me and locking every bolt, my chest heaving as I attempted to process the madness of it all. For weeks after that ghastly encounter, I tried to dismiss it as a bizarre night in a small town, but I couldn't shake the urgency in the man's voice or the sensation of being watched that followed me everywhere. The locals surely thought I was crazy when I started asking about him, but no one knew who I was speaking of. It was as if he had never existed. Then, a few weeks later, in a fit of recklessness, I decided to visit that cursed forest he spoke of, the temptation of the unknown gnawing at my sanity, seeking clarification of the fear that had gripped me. I went deeper into those woods, embraced by shadows that felt alive, and a realization washed over me: the night had come alive, and in its chill, I felt a pull, one so powerful it was as if the shadows themselves reached out for me. I wandered farther than I ever planned to, drawn to whispers that teased me from the depths of the trees. I don't remember how long I was there before I noticed the trees closing in, encircling me in a claustrophobic embrace. It was then that I finally understood the true horror of that night, the man's warning, and the terrors that lurked beyond. I felt something cold and malevolent wrap around my ankle, pulling me down, deeper into a place where shadows held all the answers, and I screamed, my voice lost to the night, a soul swallowed whole, a night I'd never forget with a man I would never see again, for I was now part of his tales, helpless against the remnants of darkness and despair entwined within those cursed woods. For years, we had an elf on the shelf named Henry, a charming little thing that my parents insisted brought us good behavior points with Santa, but to me, he was nothing more than an omnipresent nightmare, an intrusive sentinel perched on our living room shelf, judging my every move with those beady glass eyes that seemed to glisten in the dark, a piercing gaze that felt like it was dissecting my soul. I remember the countless times I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, feeling compelled to glance at him, convinced he shifted positions or was, God forbid, looking directly at me when I was doing nothing but trying to breathe. But my dread only intensified after that one horrifying night when I came downstairs for a glass of water, my parents asleep, the house eerily quiet, and there he was, Henry, but it seemed like he had moved, slumped a bit, as if gravity had finally drained the spirit from that cursed porcelain body, his cracked smile casting a ghastly pallor in the dim light of the moon filtering through the window, and I shook my head at my own foolish paranoia, dismissing the idea. But when I turned to grab the glass, a faint sound spun me around, a soft whisper of fabric brushing against something hard, and I blinked, my heart in my throat, only to find Henry had, impossibly, changed positions again. This time he was staring right at me with those soulless eyes, and I fled back to my room, convinced I was losing my mind. Weeks turned into months, the holiday season approached, but the joy that usually accompanied the time of year was lost on me. Every time I walked past that shelf and saw Henry's fixed grin, I felt like I was being swallowed whole. And then one December night, as the first snowflakes began to drift softly down from the heavens, I came home from school, exhausted and spent, only to find the house flooded with the scent of burnt cookies and pine, my joy fading into dread as I expected another night of sleepless terror fueled by the elf's piercing watch. But somehow, it felt different, softer, and I let my guard down, lured into the warmth of holiday lights twinkling around the living room until I finally plopped on the couch, peering at Henry through half-closed eyes. The flickering light highlighted the cracks and chips that lined his porcelain form, revealing at the same time this disturbing beauty, and that's when it happened. My baby brother, ending his innocent toddler stage of delightful mischief, burst into the room like a whirlwind, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, his wispy blonde hair a tornado atop his head. He dashed toward Henry, eyes wide, and I felt a sudden chill crawl down my spine as he stretched out a tiny, sticky hand and knocked Henry off his perch with a flurry of giggles. And while I expected him to shatter on impact, something dreadful took hold as Henry landed softly on the carpet, his head twisted in a way that should have split him open. But it didn't. Instead, his eyes darkened, and the air thickened as silence enveloped our home. An oppressive feeling, foreboding and malignant, washed over me, spreading like poison while my brother's laughter faded into confusion, and as I looked around for help, I felt an unnatural presence flickering at the back of my mind. the unmistakable sensation that we weren't alone. The lights above flickered, and suddenly, the temperature dropped, my breath misted in front of my face, and deep inside me, the predatory instinct to flee kicked in. But before I could react, spectacle unfolded. Henry unnaturally righted himself, eyes glinting with hunger, and where his smile had once been innocent, a grotesque version crawled back into place, wide and stretched beyond reason, revealing teeth like jagged shards of glass, and as I incapacitated in thick air, I saw flashes of memories, of times I had lied, been selfish, or lashed out, and suddenly I understood he was never there to report to Santa, he was there to siphon my soul, feeding off of my darkest fears, becoming stronger every time I sensed his watchful gaze, and, terrified, I stumbled backward while my brother's laughter turned to wails of terror at the sight of me backpedaling away, as I banged into the wall desperately searching for an escape, only to find Henry had jumped off the shelf and somehow was now standing directly in front of me, blocking the doorway. Just as I felt my sanity unravel, my parents charged into the room, all smiles and warmth, completely oblivious, yelling about how they'd just seen Artie from the bakery had dropped off goodies, and I thought about screaming to warn them, but the energy shifted, an unbearable weight crushing my chest as my younger brother's wails dissolved into a soft chortle, Henry tilting his head almost lovingly at my parents before slipping into my bedroom and disappearing. I stood frozen, horrified and relieved when the door swung back shut, allowing me to breathe just a second longer, but my heart collapsed when I realized my family no longer acknowledged my presence. Days passed in a numbing haze. My brother seemed entranced by Henry, sharing wafting giggles, while I felt like I was fading away beneath a heavy cloak of darkness, and when one evening, I crept into my brother's room, desperate for a shred of normalcy, I found them together on the floor, chatting as if they were lifelong friends. I should have dragged him out of there, slapped some sense into his adorable little face, but I was paralyzed with fear. That's when I heard the whispers merge into laughter, both of them giggling, while Henry's unnatural smile grew wider, each echo seeming to rattle my bones. Finally, that day arrived, the day before Christmas. There was no dash for presents, no excitement, only the growing understanding that something irretrievable had been lost. All the while, Henry's gaze followed me like a predator stalking its prey, each hollow laugh deepening my dread until at last I made the decision. I would end this madness, and as midnight crept closer, I cordoned my thoughts into a single fierce resolve. Gathering every ounce of courage as I tiptoed down the hall, I moved past my parents' door, still oblivious, slumbering away blissfully. Somehow, everything felt oddly quiet, like the very air was holding its breath with anticipation, and there, in the living room, beneath the twinkling strands of murderous lights, Henry loomed, waiting, for me to crack, to falter, to once again become his feast. Rage burned in my chest when I snatched Henry from his throne, brandished him above my head, and prepared to crush him against the hardwood floor. The crack of porcelain could end this, but a flood of dark thoughts enveloped me. Instead of laughter and warmth, I sensed shadows swirling around me, flitting in and out of dim corners, and somehow, I began to feel cold and regretful, all the worst parts of myself surfacing, taunting me, and as I stood frozen, I came face to face with my uncertainty, paralyzed until at last realization surged. I wasn't broken, I was angry. With all the strength I could muster, I hurled Henry straight into the fireplace. As he landed among the logs, the energy in the room shifted, the shadows screeched in horror, slithering away beneath the mantel, and then came the searing realization of warmth in my chest as a deafening crackle echoed, the flames consuming Henry's cursed form, peeling away his enchantment like a mask from his face. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, liberated. Moments later, the house swirled with an intoxicating warmth. My brother stirred, snuggled into his blanket, eyes fluttering open. Tranquility blossomed across his petite features, and by morning, Henry was nothing but ash, gone forever, and as I looked around the living room, feeling like real light had finally broken through, the joy of Christmas flooded back into my home, only for it to be overshadowed by how little I wanted to feel relief. At last, I was free, and yet an ember of worry sparked. Could those shadows return? Yet here I was, beckoning the dawn, knowing full well I would protect my brother from whatever haunted our world, but also understanding I needed to carry my own darkness forward, a shadow of what had once been. But I would nurse this new flame, for Henry was dead forever, and despite the burden that lay ahead, I welcomed the relief that filled my heart. It was a blistering summer day when my friends convinced me to join them at the river for what they described as the quintessential teenage adventure, inner tubing down the winding, sun-kissed waters. My parents were out of town, and I figured, what the hell, right? Besides, trust my friends, especially Derek and Carla, They promised it was going to be epic. So, I threw on my swimsuit, packed a cooler full of sodas, and headed out, laughing and joking as we piled into Derek's car like a bunch of thrill-seeking idiots. The river was picturesque, shimmering sun, lush trees bending over the edges, the water flowing with that gentle, inviting burble that screamed fun. We inflated our tubes right on the shore, children of the wild, ready to conquer the river like a ragtag army. The first hour was pure bliss, floating down, shouting, splashing water on each other, and reminiscing about childhood memories. We drifted lazily, sunburns starting to peek at our exposed skin, until I felt it, the unmistakable pressure in my stomach that could only mean one thing. I should have known better. I had eaten way too many snacks back at Derek's house, but now I was out here, miles down the river with no restroom in sight, feeling the impending doom of the worst kind of discomfort. I casually drifted a bit behind, trying to make light of it with humor, but my laughter was swallowed by the sound of rushing water and what felt like impending disaster. I considered my options: paddle to the shore and hope to find a bathroom, or just ride it out. Deep down, I knew it'd be a bad idea. Yet, with every passing moment, the pressure mounted, and I was painfully aware of the stares my friends were throwing at me, their laughter ringing hollow against my anxious mind. Just then, the river plunged into a small rapids, and as I gasped and whooped with adrenaline, the pressure in my gut screamed, and I knew I had to make a decision. Wisdom would have said to let it be, that no one would ever find out. But with one last surge of courage, and maybe a tad bit of madness, I naively thought I could manage both the thrill of the rapids and the growing urgency twisting my insides. It couldn't be that bad, right? As we slipped over the edge of the rapids, my fear clouded my judgment, and I lost the battle. The second I hit the calm part of the river again, I felt it release, more of an explosion than a trickle, and in that instant, I realized I'd just done the absolute unthinkable. I felt wretched, frozen in time, caught between sinking into the abyss of humiliation and acceptance. The water didn't care, just another way to taint the purity of its flow. Oh God, I looked around, panicked, and all I could see were my friends blissfully floating away, seemingly unaware of my internal meltdown. Carla caught my eye, a playful grin painted across her sun-kissed face, and I felt a chill run through me. I knew she would eventually smell it. My heart raced faster than I could paddle, trying to make myself look unbothered, but it's impossible to carry such a secret in the open air, when every breeze seems to whisper shame. A minute felt like an eternity as I prayed for the winds to shift and my friends to forget I was alive, and for a fleeting moment, they were blissfully unaware, their voices filled with laughter, until Derek suddenly paused, his nose wrinkling, and just like that, the laughter faded into an uneasy silence. "Oh, what the hell is that?" he shouted, looking at me with a mix of confusion and disgust. I watched as his expression morphed into dread. He knew. Carla turned her head, her grin melting into horror, and I felt the eyes of the world pin me to that moment forever like a haunting flashcard. The laughter disintegrated, replaced by gasps of understood betrayal. They had my number, and God help me, I was trapped. The water wrapped around me like a noose, suffocating, as horror spread among us like a contagious plague. I wanted a black hole to swallow me up, to cease to exist where I was ensnared in the stifling silence, no one wanting to breach the profound act of what had just transpired. Derek made a gagging sound and tried to steer his tube away from me, suddenly laughing, but it was hollow and bitter. I could hear it choke against his throat. "Dude, are you serious?" Carla's voice was piercing and laced with disbelief. Their laughter turned sharp, accusatory, like arrows aiming straight for my heart, every single word a reminder of my fall from grace. "You can't be serious," Derek repeated like a mantra through laughter mixed with horror, yet the moment felt too heavy to bear. I felt the world shifting beneath me, friendships teetering on the edge of collapse, while I, the warrior of shame, faced the consequences of lax judgment and urgency. The river felt like an executioner's platform, my laughter a distant memory, lost in the strum of nature's cruel symphony. The rest of the ride home was a tumult of emotions. They mocked me gently at first, but the laughter quickly turned into vicious teasing. I could no longer keep my head held high. Instead, I wanted to sink as low as possible under the waters of the current. Every splash they made felt like a calculated attack on what's left of my dignity, and I swore that day they were nothing but sharks, circling my pathetic, exposed soul. By the time we reached the shore, the laughter had dulled to mere echoes of what had happened, haunting for years on, as the memory carved itself ever so deeply into my existence. I'd hoped it would fade, that maybe, just maybe, it would become just another funny story to tell, an absurdity shared later in life. But I learned quickly that some traumas are too profound, too intimate, meant to be buried deep beneath the surface as I became the punchline in our circle, a shadow of mockery. To this day, the smell of chlorine and river water pulls me back to that fateful afternoon, the laughter of my so-called friends, and the way I unceremoniously mutilated my youth with a choice that would follow me forever. I stride through life now with a weight that can't be shed, a darkness rooted in those ephemeral moments of childish recklessness, and as I sit here and type this, my heart races, wondering if the guilt of that day will ever truly wash away. The night I decided to enter the annual town chili cook-off, I was running on fumes from a week of relentless work and a severe case of procrastination. I hadn't cooked a single thing, and the contest loomed like a dark storm cloud over my head. With locals buzzing about the event, I drove to the only grocery store in town at the last minute, convinced that I could pass off store-bought chili as my own creation. As I scanned the dull metal shelves, my head throbbed with fatigue until my eyes landed on a glistening, red can labeled Grandma Edna's Ultimate Chili. I chuckled as I considered its ironic name. Who would suspect a winner could come from a can? I threw that and a loaf of unimpressive, day-old bread into my basket, hoping to mask the laziness with some semblance of a home-cooked meal. The next morning, under the blurry light of a groggy sunrise, I dressed for the event, feeling more guilty than confident as I recalled the countless hours I spent washing brushes at the art gallery instead of perfecting my chili recipe. When I arrived at the contest, the smell of simmering spices, burnt meat, and charred vegetables assaulted my senses, reminding me of the skills I didn't possess. The air was thick with competition, the other contestants flaunted steaming pots, homemade heirlooms bubbling with pride, while I cringed in apprehension, clutching my can like a shield. My turn arrived, and I plopped the can's contents into a crockpot, deliberately adding the only special ingredient I brought, a sprinkle of overpriced chili powder I bought just as a backup. As I stirred the pot, a curious thing began to happen. The alluring aroma of the chili seemed to shift, almost coming alive as it roiled and bubbled before my eyes. I reached a state of half-hearted anticipation, coaxed by the rising steam that twisted and danced around me, enticing whispers wrapping around my mind like tendrils. I forced myself to shrug it off, focusing instead on the judging panel, who seemed suspiciously indulgent in their duties as they tasted each contestant's batch. When they finally reached my dish, the judges looked at each other with raised eyebrows, the kind that implied they knew something I didn't. Then, to my disbelief, they savored every bite, their expressions shifting from skepticism to pure rapture, their eyes lighting up as they experienced flavors they proclaimed were out of this world. I tried to brush off my growing unease, rationalizing it as mere novelty and sentiment swaying their taste buds, but it began to gnaw at me. How could mere store-bought chili elicit such primal satisfaction? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the contest culminated in a frenzy where everyone anticipated the winner. I was aching to escape the scrutiny, but then my name rang out from the loudspeaker with a triumph that felt like a 10-ton weight on my chest. I'd won. An overwhelming rush of disbelief crashed over me amidst the applause, a sea of smiling faces celebrating my culinary prowess. I accepted the trophy, the glow of victory felt hollow as if the trophy itself had become a curse. The residents cheered, the jubilant sounds faded into an eerie resonance, like a siren call luring me deeper into something I was uneasy about. In the next days, whispers of my win spread through town, but rather than basking in glory, I found myself suffocated by a nagging sensation that grew stronger with each drumming rumor. People began approaching me, asking what my secret was, how could a newcomer triumph over local legends, and my attempts to explain the store-bought chili fell flat, drowned out by a strange adoration they had stirred for me. Paranoia clawed at my sanity when I noticed friends growing distant, and old acquaintances developed an unnerving obsession with my victory. Every friendly inquiry began to feel insidious, every smile felt like a trap disguised in innocence. I became convinced that the chili wasn't the benign concoction I'd assumed, it was almost as if Grandma Edna had infused it with something beyond flavor, an emotion that drew people in like moths to a flame. In the weeks that followed, strangers began arriving at my door, murmuring incantations of praise about my legendary chili, demanding my recipe as if it were akin to Holy Scripture. I felt the walls of my home closing in. I started to avoid them, recoiling at the sight of even my closest friends discussing the arts of chili crafting with newfound zeal. Then came the night I awoke at 3 a.m. to the sound of insistent scratching at my door, like 1,000 fingernails tapping furiously, growing louder with every frenzied second. With dread clamping down upon my insides, I cautiously crept toward the window and peered out into the suffocating darkness. What I saw sent chills racing down my spine. There stood a crowd of familiar faces, drawn in by a hunger so palpable I could almost taste it, their wide eyes gleaming in the moonlight, pupils dilated and alive with a manic obsession that twisted their features into grotesque, desperate masks. They were chanting, whispering the same phrase over and over, "Chili. Chili. Chili." My heart thundered, knowing I had to escape before they noticed my presence. As silently as I could manage, I slipped back from the window and made my way to the back door, intending to flee to the safety of the streets. But as I turned the knob, I felt a warm current pulse through the air, and I froze in place, realizing the pressure resonated like the rhythm of a heartbeat. It dawned on me then that I was enveloped in the very fabric of something strange, something far beyond my comprehension. To my horror, understanding seeped into my mind. The chili was alive, a living entity that thrived on the emotions of those who consumed it, evolving into a heart of yearning that drew the hungry to me like bees to honey. My victory wasn't a stroke of luck, it was a vile curse, woven intricately into the very essence of the world I once inhabited. Suddenly, another loud bang erupted from the door, and muffled voices mingled with the rising crescendo of frantic whispers. Caught between fear and despair, I made a pact with the chill rippling through the air. I would never touch chili again. But it would appear that the prize I sought had already claimed me, leaving me forever tethered to a contest that wasn't merely about cooking, but about power that transcended the mundane. As I stood frozen in horror, the door quaked under the weight of their anticipation, and I realized the only way out was to face the truth I had run from. There would always be a price for victory, and for me, it was the realization that triumph comes at the cost of surrendering a part of your soul, a price I was no longer willing to pay. It was just another freezing Wednesday morning in the city, the kind where the chilled wind seemed to whip right through your coat and pierce your bones, but I was determined to start my day right, so I decided to treat myself to a caramel latte from my favorite cafe. I shuffled in, shaking off the cold, and watched the barista, with her warm smile and practiced speed, as she crafted my drink like it was a fine art. The place bustled with the usual morning crowd, people shuffling in and out, all blissfully wrapped in the comfort of their caffeinated rituals. I took my latte and stepped back outside, cradling the warm paper cup in my hands, the sweet aroma making my mouth water as I stood there, watching the world go by. That's when I noticed him, a scruffy-looking homeless guy sitting on the corner with a tattered coat, a beard tangled with bits of who knows what, and eyes that seemed larger than life, filled with a mixture of desperation and something I couldn't quite pinpoint. It wasn't unusual to see people like him in the city, but today, something felt different. He stared at me, and the moment our eyes connected, my heart raced in a way that startled me, a primal sensation coursing through me as if I were being sized up, judged. I started to walk away, feeling his gaze linger like a heavy shroud, but just as I stepped off the curb, I heard shuffling feet behind me. I turned to see him lurching forward, reaching out and mumbling something I couldn't discern over the bustling street noise but could only assume it was a plea. In that instant, a wave of annoyance washed over me. I didn't have time for this, not today. As I instinctively clutched my latte tighter, he made a sudden move, his hand darting forward as if he were swiping at my drink, and something snapped within me. Maybe it was the week of work stress piling up, or the fatigue settling in my bones, but I quickly elbowed him with a force I didn't know I had. A blinding surge of adrenaline rushed in as my hand struck his shoulder as if I was pushing him back, but it landed harder, knocking him off balance and he tumbled back against the sidewalk, hitting the concrete with a sickening thud that silenced the world around us. My heart raced, but this time with something cold and paralyzing. It was as if time stretched into an eternity. I watched him lie there, unconscious in the snow, a pool of his body heat quickly dissipating around him, and I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to drag him up, to apologize, but all I could do was stand frozen, the taste of the caramel turning bitter in my mouth. That was when a strange calm washed over me, almost as if I was severing the last ties to my sanity. I looked around, the passers-by blissfully unaware, eyes staring at their phones or holding their hats down as the wind howled, while a small crowd started gathering, but nobody was looking at me, and that ignited something dark and thrilling within. I felt untouchable, like the rush of a high that masked the crime I had just committed. I should have run, screamed for help, but instead, I took a sip of my latte, a wrong sense of victory warming me from the inside out, and as I stood there, the world around me began to shift. The homeless man's presence became an echo, fading into oblivion while whispers filled the air, taunting me with secrets I desperately wanted to keep buried. I hurriedly crossed the street, clutching my drink as I took one last glance over my shoulder, and just for an instant, I thought I saw his eyes flicker open, a gaze filled with an ethereal awareness that sent chills racing down my spine, but I told myself I was imagining things, I was just a paranoid person. I finally ducked into a side alley, my heart pounding as I tried to compose myself, reminding myself that nobody would know, nobody would ever find out that it was me who did this. The city continued around me, busy and uncaring, while I was left alone with the weight of a decision that I pretended was justified. Those haunting eyes replayed in my mind, but I shoved the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the mundane details of my day. Work would help distract me. The hours dragged on, but the moment I stepped out of the office that evening, the world felt different. The streetlights flickered strangely, shadows growing longer and darker as if they were reaching out for me. Just as I approached the spot where it all happened, the crowd was gone, and the street was empty. An eerie silence blanketed the area, amplifying every little sound as I felt a shiver creep up my spine. I glanced around, paranoia creep in slowly, yet I felt that compulsion, that undeniable urge to look for him. My hands trembled as I left the warmth of the cafe behind, the absence of people making the air thick with dread. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure slumped against the wall. Panic surged through me, and I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, reminding myself that he couldn't be him. This was all in my head. But as I passed by, I dared to look, and there he was. He hadn't moved an inch, not a twitch, not a sound, only the dim light of a flickering street lamp illuminating his pale face, and that moment my heart dropped. In his hand was a crumpled piece of paper, an empty expression fixed across his features, and then a sickening wave of fear clutched at my gut as I recognized it not as a simple note, but a message meant just for me. My name scrawled on it in big twisting letters, dripping like blood, and beneath it, the words echoed in the chill of the night, "You will pay." Time froze. My insides twisted in knots. I staggered back, the sudden rush of dread tightening its grip around my throat as if the world had descended into some warped nightmare I had no escape from. I turned and bolted, heart racing, eyes darting as the city blurred around me, but no matter how fast my legs moved, a chilling realization crept in: I was being hunted, and nobody but me knew the truth.